Hi everybody, Brian here from quantlabs.net. Today I am going to talk about Jim Simons. Finally got the pronounce. I always say Jim Sims, I don't know why. It seems to be Jim Simons' week with his new book coming out. Some really cool stuff. Anyways, I'm going to talk about a research paper I found a few days ago. I'm going to talk about some of that and whatnot. But if you're interested in these topics, you can always sign up to quantlabs.net/book. Get some of the tech secrets that I've kind of used and will be using, Excel and an open source screener for markets globally, as well as the other topic is new from the new Shopify store, the Python 3 for custom building bots. We've got one bot that is profitable consistently, but just the markets just don't allow it right now, as well as the US equivalent using Binance. So you can always get how to build those out by just adding to the cart and let the Shopify check you out. All right, so let's go into this article here. So if you are in the, So if you're interested in the book, go to quantlabs.net/book. If you're interested in that custom trading bot course, just go over to quantlabs.net/Python3. Quantlabs.net/Python3. Continuing on. So, did this research paper kick off Renaissance Technologies? There are apparently two papers out there put out by two guys that work together, have been working together for 30 years, that now run Renaissance Technologies. Peter Brown, Bob Mercer. Not going to get into politics here. They both worked at the Research Center at Watson Research Center at IBM. Here's the link to it at naxa.com. So I linked the article or the PDF. There's a couple other things if you want to hold out. I'll go through the paper, and it's quite interesting on the modeling techniques that they use, which I would think are similar to what Renaissance Technologies does. This is definitely for the early days of Rentech. So we can go through this. So initially they started with a Bayes theorem. They were analyzing probability analysis. This is so that they could translate between English and French, and they had these connectors between words, phrases, between the two languages. So that's what they started with. And if you download the PDF, see if it'll open up. Okay, here we are. So this is the paper. The paper is called Mathematics of Statistical Machine Translation, Parameter Estimation. Okay, this is really important. I'm going to tell you why. So this is how they estimate parameters with this type of modeling. Quite interesting. This kind of fits together two elements of concern when it comes to the process of how Rentech and its PhD researchers pull together models. So this is just one core example put out by these two guys. This is Peter F. Brown and Robert Mercer. This was written in the early 90s. So going through this paper, as I said, they started with the Bayes theorem. Then they started to break out different phrases, as said. And I'm not going to get into the details of it because I'm not a mathematician, but I'm trying to understand it. But they have this naming convention where they use little m, L, and M to represent lengths of strings, and E and L, and we use L and M to denote the corresponding variables. So then I wanted to highlight here, this is really important. This article found on Quora, titled, "What are the investment strategies of James Simons, Renaissance Technologies? I understand he employs complex mathematical models with statistical analysis to predict non-equilibrium changes." So this guy came back, named James Baker, same math as Renaissance Technology from the source. This is what he said. "I have known Jim Simons, Bob Mercer, Peter Brown since 65, 74, and 79, respectively. Renaissance has hired senior research who had formerly worked for me many years. None of these people have ever told me anything about Renaissance investment strategies. My observations have been obtained entirely from publicly available records. So this guy was the boss of the early days of James Simons. In particular, the core strategy is publicly known. It's the details that are proprietary. There are millions of detail and they are essentially to the performance. However, the question was about strategy, so that is what I'll try to answer. Really important here. The core strategy and portfolio statistical arbitrage carried out to limit and execute extremely well. Basically, portfolios of long-short positions are created to hedge out market risk, sector risk, and other types of risk that Renaissance can statistically predict. Extreme degree of hedging reduces net rate of return, but the volatility of portfolio is reduced by even a greater factor. Standard deviation of the value of the portfolio at future J is much lower than its expected date or expected value. Therefore, with a large number of trades, the law of numbers assures the probability of loss is very small. That's what I'm experiencing myself. In such a situation, leverage multiplies both the expected return and the volatility by same multiple. The general properties of the strategy can be deduced from the statement of Renaissance at the hearing Senate Permanent Committee on Investigations for July 14, 2014. So it's right here. All publicly data can bear on the movement of price of tradable instruments, news stories, reports, energy reports, crop record reports, weather, regulatory, accounting data, and of course quotes and trades from the market. The models uses to make predictions about future price. The hearing was specifically about the medallion fund. That's the one that we're all excited about. Statement says the model developed by Renaissance for medallion makes predictions that are profitably and only slightly more than often than not. These properties, the two reasons Rentech would like to have a call option on the portfolio is design leverage protection against black swan events. Leverage is needed because unleveraged the rate of return is low, like Forex. However, the volatility is much less than the expected return. There is no limit to how high the leverage could be without increasing probability of loss, at least according to the models. Through the years of use and refinement, and again, that's using their 90 plus PhDs that they have, researchers, Renaissance knows its models are reliable. However, also knows that there's risk of something happening that is not covered by the models outside prior, which is called a black swan event. Call option is ideal, blah, 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 and I'll let you read it. So the problem is they don't know how they find the parameters. The parameters, just looking for it. Well, it's somewhere in here, but what you can take out of this is the probabilities of, the parameters to measure those formulas, equations. So this article is key to as an analysis on how to find those parameters. This is what we're doing, parameter estimation using machine learning. Well, machine learning wasn't around before, where it's at now, where it's all hypey, put out by hipsters and whatnot. So, looking at this paper here, this is what I came away with. So we understand that. What we're needing to do is to understand corresponding random variables. So I'm going to show you some of the mathematical techniques as used. Lagrange multipliers are used, normalizing predictive data. There's a mention of all these different types of functions. Auxiliary to generate desirable parameters using extrema maxima analysis. conditional parameters. And again, on these pages, translation, distortion, and fertility probability. So it's all about probability. And what they also look at is they run different types of models to try to get the same answer. So this model here, number 5, powerful but unwieldy ally in the battle to ally translation. So it kind of meets the goal that they're after as a solution. It must be led to the battlefield by its weaker and more agile brethren, models 2, 3, and 4. This is the raison d'etre of these models, like my French. To keep them aware of the lay of the land, we adjust the parameters as we carry out many or iterations of something called the EM algorithm for model 5. So you can see here they do a lot of analysis. We collect counts for model 2, 3, and 4, summing the alignments, which is the different connectors between the phrases, between French and English words and phrases. Collect as determined by the abbreviated S described using model 5 to compute P, the probability of this function here. I'll let you go through the paper to understand it. This appears to increase the storage necessary for maintaining counts. Storage necessary is computing power as we proceed through the training data. And they walk through the exact process of how to do the training and collecting of the data. Extra burden is small because overwhelming majority of the storage is devoted to counts. And these are the same for all the other models. So here they have another section on the number of translations done and collected. It went into the millions to determine a small set of small words. EM algo is also used with maximum likelihood. So from what I'm understanding here, in order to do this, what they're doing is they're going through a million iterations of testing this, like training, testing the data, and trying to find patterns of certain words that will be considered useful for their result of the problem set. So here's the actual numbers. Entire T array has 2.4 million entries. They need to store it twice, one for the probability and one as a count. And again, this paper walks you through it. It was clear from the preceding remarks that we need to never deal with more than 25 million counts and more than 12 million probabilities. That's insane. From one of the videos I watched, and also I'm going to tell you, there's an audio file of both Peter Brown and Bob Mercer talking about the horsepower that they have access to within the data server, I guess data warehouse that Rentec has built. It's over 10,000 CPUs, 10,000 processors. So 283 linguistic volume number count as pairs of bytes. Now this is getting into the nitty-gritty of the actual data structures they use. If you go to Rentec right now and you look for the job listings, they will show you that the coders that implement this stuff only use C++. So now what they're getting into is actually the data structures that are used within the C++. So they keep count as pairs of bytes, data type, but allow for overflow into 4 bytes. This way it is possible to run the training program in less than 100 megabytes of memory. And blah, 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 and it goes. I found that quite interesting. Plus, they mention using this thing I've never heard of, Vertebi algo training. Look her up, I don't know. We have already used algorithms successfully to assign senses to English and French words on the basis of context as they appear. And then this paper is really good because they give you a summary of what all the different notations mean. They also give you a summary with some proofs of the actual equations. So this is a summary of the different models. There's a ton of them. Like I said, they use log likelihood objective function as an example. They also talk about the iterative improvement using mathematical techniques. In order to apply these algorithms, we need to solve the maximization problems of step 2 and 4 for the models we consider to do this explicitly. This is what I also found interesting, is the models for parameter re-estimation formula in order to apply these algorithms. We need to solve the maximization problem of the certain range of steps for the models that we consider we can do this explicitly. One equation is useful in computation since it involves only I can never get the speed notation in arithmetic operations, whereas the original sum over alignments involve this operation. Here's the thing. So that's a pretty good walkthrough of how to estimate these parameters. It's very complex. You can just go through that one research paper. Apparently there's another one. I'd be interested to get my hands on that if it's similar technique to this one. Because if it is, and these guys are the top dogs in Rentech, that must mean that they want this methodology, this type of estimating parameters to be, and they were one of the early ones in there and still in charge, that they probably have these techniques and methodologies used throughout Rentech over the last set of decades to come up with these parameters. Now, here's the interesting thing. I put up a PDF, and what you really want to know is an old interview from 2013. I've never seen this before. I listened to it. It's about an hour long, and they walk you through the whole process of how Rentech come up with the models. They don't go into specifics, but what essentially they do in this presentation is some, I don't know if it's a math group, I guess it's a math group in the New York area where they're all based. What they do is they have this thing called Research Week or Journal Week. Essentially what they try to do is try to get all the PhDs, the researchers, to read about 3 research papers a week. That's what that was said in by one of the two guys, Peter Brown or Bob Mercer. So if they have 90 researchers, PhDs of different backgrounds, astrophysicists, physicists, they call them experimental physicists, all kinds, and they're looking for these folks to come up with solutions in alternative ways, I guess you could say, and then apply them and see if they can implement it and it can become tradable. Let me just walk you through this PDF here. Okay, so majority of what I talk about has already been covered in this PDF, but let me just go to the end here. So this link here, it's somewhere in here. You can download it. Okay, this one right here with the arrows. So it's an audio speech. This is what I'm referring to. In there, with not just what I heard, but they also talk about the workflow on how the models are implemented. And what they do is they have all these researchers go through all these research papers, and then what they think may work, they'll have a coding team to implement them and to see if it actually works. But the other interesting fact was there was a question regarding when something comes up, and again, this is in 2013, this is like 6 years ago. So when somebody comes up with a trading idea, they have to be so secretive and not talking about pretty well anything, because if it's leaked out, that trading opportunity is what they call gets traded out. So the opportunity will last for, who knows, a day, a week, but a very small amount of time. And the problem is that it gets traded out. So it means that there's so many people, competitors, trying to get an understanding of what is happening with these opportunities, that as other participants come in and take advantage of that opportunity, it eventually gets traded out, so that profitability, the amount of time that opportunity is there is very small. So another question came out, and the answer was, how often does this happen? How hard is it? It says it's very, very hard now because there's more participants. But if you look at the when that book came out a week ago or so, that book showed how since 2014 the value of just Jim Simons alone has added $10 billion to his net worth. And Jim Simons owns something like roughly 50%. I saw it on some link, where he owns a large portion of the company. And you got to remember, Jim Simons hired these guys. These are not brought in as they were, like, from what I see, they're probably getting a share of the company, but the proportion of shares, a good chunk of it's still owned by Jim Simons, because I think it's around 50%. And then these two guys, Peter Brown and Bob Mercer, have smaller percentages. Where I checked the net worth of Bob Mercer, he's a billionaire, probably a couple billion, maybe $2 billion. Peter Brown, I checked his net worth, he's only worth $100 million. So I don't know what's going on there, but it seems these guys are definitely getting a smaller portion of the available shares, whereas the proportion of shares ownership is definitely Jim Simons, who's probably got half the company, and that's why he's able to build out and add $10 billion since 2014 to his net worth. Whereas the Medallion Fund, from that book, or there was a link on it, where they only added $13 billion under management. And that's over the last same time period. So Jim Simons, over the last five years, has had $10 billion to his net worth. Meanwhile, the proportion of how much is managed under Rentec is only added another $13 billion. So the proportion of net worth has gone up much faster for Jim Simons. And also remember that doesn't matter. So there's a lot going on here. It's quite fascinating. A couple of other things I want to update you with. Let me see here. A couple of things that I think is important when you download this PDF. I also look for other proportions, how they do the weighting on their stock. When their systems go out and buy stock and evaluate the future moves of those stock and the proportions. So here, this guy, I think, and I got the link here somewhere. Yeah, this link right here in the Cora. This guy went in and assessed this article. And what he's saying is that they have bought a stock and breaks up the percentages, the weighting of each stock. And then he also talked about the ranking of how they do it, potentially, of this ergodic ranking. Don't ask me, but that's something, top 6 of the 1,300 stocks out there. So he talks about that. So the portfolio weighting as well. Because what you'll know in what I'm doing, the weightings are very important, because if you expect a move and you deploy more capital on that potential move, obviously the more profit you make. For me, Bitcoin's one example of that because it's so big. So you might want to read this part. He also talked about the computational needs for the CPU. But again, consistently from different videos and different interviews, it sounds like they have about 10,000 CPUs, processors, but 10,000 was the key number, how much they have available. That was also mentioned in this interview or presentation put on by Peter Brown and Bob Mercer as well. So that was mentioned. Lots of interesting things here. Now, from a programmatic standpoint, I don't know if you know, but there is on GitHub a project put out by a guy, HT Wei or something like that, WEI. This little project here is called MR Sync. It's all in C++, I believe, or C, and it makes references to other authors on GitHub. And then they also mention about metaprogramming library. There's one called Blade, and the different techniques they use in C++ to lighten the memory usage in C++. On top of that, they have other this Blade, which will go out and process large arrays over multiple processors. So that's something that they may use. I'd be surprised by that they would have written their own solution. This article was quite interesting where, again, regulators want the source code. And they said no because they worry about it. It gets back in the wild, and they basically was shut down because of that. Also, there is a Renaissance 13F strategy report. How much they pay the staff, which is surprisingly a good amount, but it's not like top end for that. Also, there was a question here about the sample holdings. This is what I was referring to in this article on the weightings. This is just a sample of the things that they hold. In this article here, where is it? Sample holdings. There was also a third-party software they use for accounting purposes called Advent Geneva. This one is about the first CEO of Rentech, Howard Morgan. He had an article on that. I think that's kind of outdated. There was a mention of this on Y Combinator. Talking about computing, processing, nothing really interesting there. Fundamental analysis. Forex signals with algo trading with Rentech. Another article. I think one of these is quite interesting as well. The real big one is this one with Peter Brown and Bob Mercer. This is back to 2013. I don't think anything's really changed outside of what they discover through the research process with all these 90 plus researcher PhDs that they got. Another interesting article was put out in 2000 by Jim Simons. So quite a lot there. I'm going to look for that other research paper, see if the math techniques, the formula techniques is similar to this one. And also this article, for anybody, it's quite interesting to listen to as well, the audio speech or presentation between Peter Brown and Bob Mercer, because they're still the top two guys at Rentech. So there you go. Hopefully that'll be valuable to certain people. That's probably as far as I can go so far. And apparently the new book, there's some good stuff on there. There was an article posted on my website on some of the lessons learned, but watching Jim Simons and these guys, Peter Brown and Bob Mercer, don't expect some secret sauce stuff. I think the only thing you can work off of is piecing it all together like I'm doing here. But most interesting from a mathematical standpoint is how they build the parameters for their models. And I think the one I just showed you at the beginning is your best bet on how it's done. But you got to be really sophisticated in the math side of things. You just can't copy, and you got to be really innovative. Other than that, hopefully I'll help you out. We shall talk to you later. Have a good day.